Well, Deadly Sins Month is finally coming to an end, and I haven't done a lot of videos on that month, mostly because I've found other topics that I found infinitely more interesting than those, but that's not to say I haven't been at least partially paying attention, assuming you could even get away from it in the first place, and that I don't have anything to talk about. In fact, I do. A lot to talk about, in fact, because this month has been kind of unique when it comes to Pride Month, or at least Deadly Sin Months that I've personally experienced. Because you see, generally with June, the LGBT groomers have been pretty solid about keeping the messaging very clear and very controlled, at least within this particular month, for the most part. But this month was a bit different. You see, a lot of things went horribly, terribly wrong, and this begins not even at the beginning of the month. Before the beginning of the month, in fact, there was a whole rigmarole about kinks at Pride, where the LGBT groomers were arguing about whether they should groom in public or not. No, I'm not kidding. Their whole argument here was about whether at Pride marches it should be acceptable for people to show up in full-on bondage gear and go and interact with the 9-year-olds at Pride marches, or whether it was acceptable to bring children under the age of consent to these sorts of marches at all. And it should tell you something about the optics situation when even Vosh, patron saint of ethical child porn himself, is coming out and saying, yeah, you guys are going a bit too far this time. This was an utter PR disaster, and the month hadn't even begun yet, but it didn't abate going into the month because it just kept on rolling. And I want to begin with the beauty that is the Skittles marketing for Pride Month. Now, you see, it is not uncommon, in fact, it is quite common to see many corporations and other doldrums of society change their logos during June to show off rainbows and racial pride flags and all of these sorts of things, except in their Middle Eastern divisions. But Skittles did something a bit unique. You see, rather than showing the rainbow, which is already in their logo to begin with, they decided to take it away. And how did they take it away? Well, they created Richard Spencer's wet dream in Skittles form, taking away the rainbow and instead creating a white ethno-state of Skittles. And this is where we begin with the ideas that I just cannot believe were not deliberate. There is no way no one looked at this and was like, yeah, maybe there's a problem there. There is no way I can believe that no one looked at this and didn't think to themselves, well, what could go wrong here? There is no way, and there is a number of examples to this exact same effect. There was a tweet from the official @Pride account on Twitter that showed a person shoving off a pride flag off a building. Amazing. There's no way that this was an accident. There's no way this wasn't on purpose at some level. There's no way that someone didn't realize what they were doing. I cannot believe that. And, you know, a lot of this is a bit on the margins. I admit, there is a lot to talk about with regard to LGBT issues and whatnot that I'm not really getting into. I'm just skirting on the side, maybe making some arguments here and there, but for the most part, I'm just laughing at their incompetence. Well, I can make a more substantive argument by looking at the aftermath of certain pride marches, where, well, they're a huge mess, full of litter all over the place, just garbage on the floor, in fountains, all over the place, just garbage and filth and all this nonsense. And you might say that, well, no, this is normal for these sorts of things happening in big cities. It's not uncommon to see all sorts of trash and litter in massive events like this. Well, that might be true for leftist events, but if we look over to right-wing events, might I remind you of the Tea Party, where whenever they did a protest, they left it cleaner than they found it. Because it turns out that when you create a march purely based on the idea that we shouldn't limit ourselves at all and we shouldn't maintain any level of discipline on any level, turns out people are going to be undisciplined. Turns out that when you destroy the concept of purpose, when you destroy the concept that people should control themselves and not do whatever they desire and instead follow some form of propriety, they're just going to do whatever they want. And guess what that leads to? It leads to things like littering all over the place, despite the fact that many of these people would fully admit to being environmentalist activists. That's the sort of people who are going to these sorts of pride marches. And I didn't get to the end of this whole thing, because the cherry on top of all of this has to come in the form of the resurgence of transracialism. You see, transracialism has been kind of dormant for a while. The last time I saw it come up was back in 2016, one of the times when Rachel Dolezal reared her head over at the relevance corner and kind of got in. It's not been a huge issue or a huge topic for a very long time, but that has all changed now that a transracialist, a trans Korean to be more specific, has come out. And he has come out in full, going for the full surgery all the way through. And, well, the progressives are not particularly happy about this. You see, transracialism is in a kind of weird spot for when it comes to progressive hierarchy and identity politics and whatnot, because progressives are racists, and so they believe that there is some form of genetic argument for race. That's why they come up with terms such as whiteness. Now, I've personally said that they are not necessarily ethnically racist, that they're not necessarily genetically racist, but are instead spiritually racist, and this still follows with the general conception of that. People on the left still believe in a genetic portion of race. They just believe that it's not absolute. They believe that it can be changed, but it has to be constantly fought against, that this is a genetic thing. And so transracialism finds itself in a very strange position of being at the junction of transgenderism and otherkin and all of these, even transageism and that sort of thing, where many people on the left, while not necessarily explicitly supporting every single aspect of that, not necessarily supporting otherkin or transageism, will come out will generally accept the fundamental logic, which is your body doesn't matter. Your genetics are of complete irrelevance as to what you are, even if we're talking about a genetic descriptor. Instead, all that matters is your personal perception of what you are. That is the fundamental logic behind all of these sorts of things when you get down to the basics of it. And the same goes for transracialism. But because of the other aspect of their ideology, that being of CRT and whiteness as a grand evil, they cannot completely abide by transracialism because it funds afoul of that one. So they have to try and weasel their way out of accepting it as fundamentally the same thing as something like transgenderism. And this, in all likelihood, is going to fall in some way. One of these aspects of their ideology has to fall at some point. And I found this particular instance of transracialism to be quite interesting because his arguments for as to why transracialism is the same as transsexualism, transsex, or all of these sorts of things, making this equivalence, was very interesting because an old argument from the 2015 version of transgenderism reared its ugly head once again, where instead of arguing that race is a social construct, or that you can choose whatever you want because race and ethnicity are different, or something along those lines, he instead attempted to argue that his body was wrong, which is the original argument for transgenderism. Go back to 2015, when the Caitlyn Jenner thing was happening, or go back even further than that. Go back to studies about this respect. Go back to when the DSM was calling gender dysphoria, gender identity dysphoria. The same arguments were being made then, which is very interesting because this argument has been almost entirely discarded by transgenderism, mostly because it runs afoul of part of their linguistic argument, because their linguistic argument relies on the idea that gender and sex are fundamentally different, until they start arguing that sex is a social construct too, but we're not going to get into that. What this means is that they can't argue your body is necessarily wrong, of course, all the while arguing that you should get cosmetic genitalia surgery, or sex reassignment surgery, or gender reassignment surgery. The funny thing that is, they can't fundamentally argue that you need to change your body, because your body is what has the sex. It's what has your sex. It's what contains it. It's what defines it. And so they cannot make that argument generally anymore, especially since they've gone so entrenched with their particular arguments on this front. So it's very interesting to me that this particular argument was brought back. And I don't know exactly how the progressives are going to respond to this, because that initial argument was the wedge issue that brought transgenderism into the mainstream. And so if they reject it, they might end up inadvertently completely collapsing their entire argument. And so it's kind of interesting to think about where that may go in the future, especially if they're going to keep attacking transracialism as they've been doing for years. And I think that's where I'm going to leave you guys off. If you enjoyed that video, do in fact subscribe down below, and check out my other platforms like BitChute, Odyssey, Gab, Parler, Minds, those social media websites where I'll occasionally put my thoughts even. And also check out breakingонthedaily.locals.com, where you can go and post and you can join the community and see all that sort of stuff. That's where I'm going to leave you guys off. I'm KelKidman. This has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.